It's a dungeon. A chamber where someone was held captive and tortured for months, years, kept alive only to suffer for someone else's pleasure. Today on the Comic Book Report, Dark Spaces Dungeon by Scott Snyder. Stick around and check it out. Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I'm back reviewing another great modern IDW release back into the world of the Dark Spaces anthology series. That's right, this is Dark Spaces Dungeon. Really excited to talk about this today. I believe this was optioned for a television or film project, which is really exciting as well. Dark Spaces Dungeon is the second in the anthology series Dark Spaces, and this is a tight, tense psychological thriller that borders on horror. Absolutely. I was really fascinated by this one and I can't wait to dive in. Before we do though, I'd just like to say a special thank you to IDW for providing this review copy in exchange for an honest review. Huge thank you there. Now let's go ahead and get started. First, some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this volume were written by Scott Snyder and penciled by Hayden Sherman, with coloring from Patricio Del Peche. The issues in this collection were published by IDW beginning in 2023. The volume itself collects Dark Spaces Dungeon, issues 1 through 5. And finally, this is a standard size trade paperback collection with glossy print paper stock, a glued binding, and a total of 144 pages. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and issue a general spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first dedicated look at the front of today's standard size trade paperback from IDW. Definitely a horrific, frightening image here. I love it. We have the would-be tormentor and our two lead characters here at the bottom and what looks like kind of a maze. I just think it's really an evocative cover, and the designers for this collection picked like the perfect picture for this collection. Transitioning to the spine, we have a nice little thing up top that says Dark Spaces, noting the name of this anthology series. We have Dungeon, the title of this particular volume. We have the creators, IDW, and I love that it retains the kind of greenish hue from the front cover. And I should say there is some uniformity, at least with this and the first volume I can speak to, Dark Spaces Wildfire, which I reviewed on the channel recently for those interested. I will do a comparison shot with these first two volumes of Dark Spaces, but it is a total anthology, so each of these collections can be read standalone. I really enjoyed that. The back cover of this trade paperback as well is really well done. I love the imagery we got on the back, just delving more into the interior art and kind of the spaces we explore in this work. We have a blurb about the collection, of course, pricing information, all of our standard stuff. Overall, I thought a really well-made exterior. And now, of course, we're going to go ahead and transition to a quick look at the binding. So like I said earlier, this is a glued binding. All pretty straightforward here. There's maybe a little bit of gutter loss, but nothing I couldn't see when I pushed down the pages a bit. I really didn't have any issues with this. I thought it was really well bound and about what I expect for a standard trade paperback. And now that we've gone ahead and seen the build of the book, let's go ahead and go over to that comparison shot I mentioned. So this is Dark Spaces Dungeon next to the first entry in this series, Dark Spaces Wildfire. Again, by the same creative team, at least writer and penciler. We do have a different colorist, and wow, what a difference that makes. Both colorists did a phenomenal job on each work, but the tone is just so shifted and different, and I thought that was pretty wild. As well as the visuals from Sherman, I think that the range of that artist is pretty tremendous, and you'll see that if you compare this with the previous work, Wildfire. Looking at the compared spines here, you can see what I mentioned earlier about the uniformity. I love the similarities we get between the two of them, obviously other than the titles and the coloring, but everything else looks great, lines up perfect on the bookcase. And as we finish up here at the comparison shot, I think it's finally time to dive into the collection proper. Okay, and as we make our way into the collection, we have a title page, publication information page, some things about the creators there, and then we jump right into the first issue. Now, this is a 5-issue little mini-series, I would say, or storyline within Dark Spaces. Like I've said, this is an anthology series, so each of these volumes is essentially a standalone, one-and-done kind of story. Like I've said already as well, I did review Dark Spaces Wildfire recently on the channel. That was the first kind of outing for Dark Spaces. This is the second storyline, and wow, it's such a dynamic change of pace, which is even more illuminating because we have the same writer and penciler for both the initial Wildfire story and now this one with Dungeon. We did change colorist, and the style that the penciler employs is quite a bit different. I feel like we're also removed a little bit more from the internal monologue exposition dumps that we get sometimes with Snyder, which I am a fan of. We have little moments, but honestly, it's all very externalized kind of dialogue in this story, and it works so well. We also have a genre shift. The first series, Wildfire, was kind of like a thriller heist kind of story. This is a straight up psychological thriller, action, horror kind of story. It reminds me of, like, if you've watched the series True Detective, the first season of that, or maybe like Silence of the Lambs. There are like similar vibes to some of those works and other mediums. But yeah, really, really good story here. And what is that story exactly? Well, our story picks up with basically a young man escaping from what appears to be a torture chamber 20-something years before the events of the main story. We flash forward, and basically a young family, a husband, wife, and their young son, live kind of an idyllic sort of existence. He's sort of like a tech million or billionaire, and he's out running by his house one day, and he trips over what looks like a manhole cover in the middle of the woods. He opens it up and investigates, and the next thing you know, he's calling in the FBI or whatever kind of federal authorities needed to check out what he found, which is essentially this sort of torture dungeon. And basically from there, we cut over to our big kind of FBI or authority guy who's kind of rounding up another kind of crazed criminal of some kind. Anyway, he gets the call, drops everything, because this is the case he's been trying to close his whole life. They meet up with this family, they go down into the dungeon, and there's ominous messages, kind of like if you tell anyone, you're next. But of course, this guy blew the whistle, brought in the authorities, and now the hunt is on. We find out that this authority figure was actually the young man who was tortured and escaped in the beginning of the story, and he's basically devoted his life, pursued criminology and justice and all this stuff to basically try to find this deranged kidnapper, torturer, possible serial killer. And basically this man, or whoever is behind all this, basically kidnaps these people and puts them into these little like pod dungeon things underground. And there's these little boxes that come out of the walls that will poke and contort their bodies out of place and stay there as a mean of torture. And anyway, it's just horrific. And presumably he's the only one that's gotten away. And the kind of psychological games this kidnapper and killer would play. Basically, there's insinuations that there were others that he kidnapped throughout the country. And anyway, since he escaped, he's been trying to capture this man, and this is the first real lead they've had in some time. Before too long, though, we find out that the menace of this crazy kidnapper guy is still very, very much a threat. In fact, the man who found this torture dungeon basically has his own son kidnapped by this just wild person, and basically him and the authority guy, the FBI guy, basically team up and trying to bring him down no matter what the cost. So really personal stakes for both of them here. He gets thrown off the case, but he just does it anyway because there's just too much at stake, both for him personally and now for this man who's lost his son. And they're trying to catch him so they could free this boy before time runs out, and also try to free any other victims they can along the way. From here, the story really pivots to kind of them traveling and chasing down any leads they can find. We eventually find another survivor who has ominous messages from this character. And anyway, this is really the bulk of the story. It's, again, a well-paced, just psychological horror thriller of these two men trying to find this serial torturer and kidnapper. We have plenty of fun twists and turns. We have a couple interrogation sequences, stakeouts, them finding clues and things. And ultimately, it culminates with them finding another of these sort of torture dungeons, basically finding the son, and basically dispatching the presumed kidnapper of children. So after that, we have kind of a wrap-up epilogue to the series. The two men who captured and ended this kidnapper basically are much celebrated. You know, the authority guy gets reinstated. Again, all the awards and everything. And we basically have him coming by to visit the family now that the boy has been safely returned. And he's just kind of going over the case. And even though it should be really happy, there is kind of an unease to this scene. And ultimately, he drops the knowledge that basically this authority guy says, I don't think he was working alone, and I think it's you. So yes, this whole time, the guy who had his son abducted was actually a huge player in this conspiracy of the torture dungeon. He is really the puzzle maker and kind of the mastermind behind all of it, and it's just really chilling. And we have him ultimately like drug the authority guy, and he wakes up in the dungeon once again, having never really been able to escape or at least get caught right back up in it. And honestly, that's how the story ends. It's haunting, chilling, and just wow, what a great ending to that. I think it really earned it, honestly, the twists and turns there. The whole ride was a ton of fun, but that little epilogue and the flourish and twists at the end, it just made this a real stunning piece of work. I think that there's a lot you can analyze with this series, and honestly, it was a real treat. I am not surprised at all that this was optioned for some kind of live action adaptation, because I could definitely see the cinematic qualities of this work. The characters were all great. I think the cast of characters was a bit smaller compared to Wildfire, or at least the primary characters. But yeah, it was really well done. It's a totally different genre, as I've said. I do think it was a stronger narrative than what we saw in Wildfire. But again, it's a little bit like comparing apples and oranges, just because they're different genres, different characters, all of that. The art direction we had from Hayden Sherman is also absolutely stunning. Again, the coloring is quite a bit different than what we saw in Wildfire, and the style is even a bit different. This one's a little more straight-laced and realistic looking. I really liked it, and yeah, wow. At the back of the book, as you saw, we had a couple of kind of cover art thumbnails that we saw and a brief little blurb or two about the creators, and that was really it. We got less extras with this collection compared to Wildfire. We didn't really get character sketches or things like that. I would have loved to see more extras, particularly with this one, especially after seeing all those we got with Wildfire, but I'm still happy we got a little bit of something, and that's really it for Dark Spaces Dungeon. All that's left to do now is to give this book a grade. For this tense psychological horror thriller, the Comic Book Report is happy to give Dark Spaces Dungeon an A-. If you are a fan of this genre in storytelling, period, or a fan of these creators, I would consider this book a must-read. The fact that it's also a great one-and-done comic book collection, it's just a no-brainer for me. Absolutely love that I had a chance to pick up this book. I think that this is the crowning jewel for this series so far for me. I can't wait to see a potential adaptation of it in the future. This really has me just wanting to revisit it already. It was a really stunning piece of work. But honestly, that's just my impression and opinion here. I would love to hear yours. Have you read any of the Dark Spaces stories? Have you read Dungeon? Are you a fan of these creators? Let me know all of that in the comments section. I'd like to thank everyone for making it this far into the review, and again, a huge thank you to those at IDW for sending me this review copy in exchange for an honest review. This was a real fun one, guys, and until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to leave your like, comment, and maybe share this review with a friend. Thanks everyone, have a good one.